Uh, Welcome to this evening's program. I'm Mike Devine. I'm the director of the Harry S. Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, and it's a delight to be here at the Truman Forum to welcome all of you and introduce tonight's speaker. I'd certainly like to begin by acknowledging our partners, the Truman Library Institute, a private not-for-profit organization that supports the work of the Truman Presidential Library, and of course the Kansas City Public Library that operates this magnificent facility and has worked with us on a variety of programs, including the presidential series Hail to the Chiefs, which has been a great success, and is also working with the library and the Institute on Beyond the Gowns, a history of a number of presentations on the U.S. Supreme Court, and Dateline Washington with David Von Draley. I'd also like to acknowledge the great support that all of these partners have had from the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation. Without the funding from that important source of philanthropy here in the Kansas City community, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. And certainly we're grateful to Tom McDonald and the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation for their support. Tonight's program is offered in conjunction with a new exhibit we've recently opened at the Harry S. Truman Library in Independence. It's an exhibit entitled Americans in Fear, Spies, Lies, and Paranoia. And it deals with the early years of the Cold War, which I suspect some of you in the audience are of a certain age, as I am, who have some vague memories of the early years of the Cold War, when we were looking for spies just about everywhere. The U.S. State Department, government agencies in general, Hollywood, elected officials, possibly even presidential candidates might have been tainted with communism. And not to mention also fears of a nuclear holocaust, and overriding all of this, our concern for alien invaders from outer space. We are, believe it or not, from time to time asked at the Truman Library if we have information on what happened in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947, and maybe we have the green guys locked up in the basement somewhere. And this paranoia, while there were real enemies out there and real concerns, to some extent was fueled by government, by individuals in government, elected officials and government officials as well, telling us how we should be concerned about possibly our own neighbors being spies, and also the popular media. The biography that we'll hear about tonight from its author, Douglas Waller, concerns one of the most powerful men in modern espionage, Wild Bill Donovan, a swashbuckling, larger-than-life spymaster who created the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, during the Second World War, and introduced Americans really for the first time to a wide-ranging espionage operation. I mean, there had been spies even during the American Revolution, but nothing quite as systematic and as vast as Bill Donovan created during the Second World War. Our author tonight, also I'd like to point out, received support from the Truman Library and the Truman Library Institute. The Institute provided him with a travel grant to come to the library and conduct his research. And these travel grants have been an important part of preserving and enhancing the legacy of the Truman administration. The Truman Library was really the first presidential library to make travel grants available to researchers. Harry Truman himself provided some of the funding. He would turn over his little $200 and $300 honoraria for giving public appearances to the Presidential Library to help build a fund that supported research. And so just to an extent, tonight's presentation is a result of research conducted at the Truman Library and supported by a travel grant from the Truman Library Institute. Let me get to the matter at hand, introducing our speaker. But first, let me say that the Truman Library exhibit on spies, lies, and paranoia is open every day and will be up and running for the next several months, and we do encourage you to come out there. You'll get a chance to be a spy yourself when you go through that exhibit. You are given a little special decoding device, and as you go through the exhibit, there are messages that need to be decoded, and if you're skillful enough to decode these messages at the end of the exhibit, you'll be able to solve a riddle that has been presented to you related to espionage. So that's all the hyping I'm going to do this evening for our exhibit at the Truman Library. Our speaker tonight, Douglas Waller, is a veteran magazine correspondent, author, and lecturer. In almost 2 decades as a Washington journalist, he has covered the Pentagon, Congress, the State Department, the White House, and the CIA. From 1994 to 2000, Douglas Waller served in Time Magazine's Washington's Bureau, first as a correspondent and then as senior correspondent. At Time, Mr. Waller covered foreign affairs, traveled throughout Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, and spent a great deal of time in the Persian Gulf area. His biography of General William Wild Bill Donovan, the World War II director of the Office of Strategic Services, is the 8th book he has either authored or co-authored. He was born, Doug Waller was born in Norfolk, Virginia, and holds a BA from Wake Forest University and a master's in urban administration from North Carolina University at Charlotte. He is also a former captain in the United States Marine Corps Reserve. So please join me in welcoming to the podium this evening our speaker, Douglas Waller.
Didn't you just love the spy music that was on right before, James? I thought it was kind of set the mood here and everything. It's good to return to Kansas City. I was here in your neck of the woods for about 3 weeks. I spent a week and a half at the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. Then I took a car to the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, Kansas. I had a delightful time. I highly recommend if you can go out to those libraries, not only to see the museums, which are excellent there, but also maybe just sit down and read through some of the material. A lot of people any of you can walk in and get a reader's card and start looking through it, and you can really see how history comes alive through the words on the papers there. You can almost see the president talking to you, with the little notes he writes on the side on the memo. Wild Bill Donovan. Basically, we're talking here about 3 different stories. We're talking about the story of a person with a very compelling personal biography who actually met with a lot of tragedy in his life. This is a spy story, too, about espionage and intrigue and subterfuge during World War II. Very, very exciting spy story. And it's a tale of political intrigue in Washington at the highest level of government. And this is where Harry Truman fits into it, and we'll talk about that later. And this is the part that actually kind of interested me the most, since I'm a former journalist. In fact, I've said that I would have loved to have been a reporter back then covering Donovan. And if I had been, I probably would have covered him extensively. Donovan liked reporters. He routinely leaked to reporters all the time. In fact, he had reporters on his staff serving as propagandists and spies, in some cases while they were still reporting for their newspapers. Rules back then in journalism were a little loosey-goosey. He wasn't a particularly tall man. He was only about 5'9". One of his agents, Betty McIntosh, said that when he ran the OSS, he kind of looked penguin-shaped to her. In fact, she told him that one day, and he didn't really appreciate it. Another one of his agents, Mary Bancroft, said he looked like a Cupid doll. Does anybody know what a Cupid doll is? Yeah, I didn't have a clue what it was until somebody at a book talk brought one to me. It's a little bald-headed thing with ears and everything. He slept 5 hours or less a night, speed read about 3 books a week. He was an excellent ballroom dancer. He loved to sing Irish songs. In fact, he'd go to Broadway and buy up the latest sheet music so he could memorize the words. He didn't smoke, rarely drank, enjoyed fine dining, although it tended to add to the weight. He spent lavishly, had no concept for a dollar. In fact, when he was roaming the world, visiting his different OSS stations, he was always bumming dollars and quarters off the aides who were with him because he never kept any money with him. He was witty, but he never laughed out loud. He never told a dirty joke. He never showed anger. Instead, he let it boil inside of him. He was also rakishly handsome. He had these bright blue eyes that women found absolutely captivating. His life also was filled with a lot of personal tragedy. His daughter died in an automobile accident in college. His daughter-in-law died of a drug overdose. One of his granddaughters, when she was 4 years old, died when she accidentally swallowed silver polish. A lot of sadness in his life. He was born on New Year's Day, 1883, in Buffalo, New York's poor Irish First Ward. In fact, I gave a book talk to Buffalo to the Irish Center in the First Ward. Everybody was drinking Guinness and whiskey shooters, so after 15 minutes, it didn't matter what I said. And I was in the middle of the talk, and somebody raised their hand and politely informed me that I'd been mispronouncing Donovan's name throughout the talk. That if you were from the Irish First Ward, you would pronounce it Donovan, not Donovan like I did. Of course, it fouled me up for the rest of the talk. He thought he might wanted to become a priest. In every Irish Catholic family, it was always assumed that one of the sons would become a priest, and Donovan thought that was going to be him. Realized later on that he wasn't cut out to be a man of the cloth. He went to Columbia University, was a star quarterback on the football team his senior year until he got hobbled by a cheap tackle by a Princeton lineman. He then went to Columbia Law School. Franklin Roosevelt also attended the law school at that time. In fact, Roosevelt later liked to say that he and Donovan were old buddies in law school. And Donovan said, oh, that's a bunch of baloney. Roosevelt was on a much higher social strata than a poor kid from Buffalo. He returned to Buffalo after law school, set up a law practice, married one of the richest women in town. World War I, he led a battalion with the 69th Irish Regiment, a very famous regiment. In fact, they did a movie on it. Jimmy Cagney played in it. Donovan was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for heroism in battle during World War I. In fact, the chaplain of the 69th Irish Regiment, a guy named Father Francis Duffy, said Donovan was the only man he had ever met in his life who actually enjoyed combat. And he really did. He would write home to his wife Ruth that going out on combat missions was like going out trick-or-treating at night. He was also during World War I is when he got his nickname Wild Bill. He was a very rigorous, almost a brutal trainer of his men because he realized they were going to be going into a meat grinder of combat in World War I, which they did. So before they actually went into action in France, he had them running over hill and dale and over obstacle courses under barbed wire and everything. Finally, the entire battalion collapsed in front of him. And he stood up there all Johnny and said, well, you know, what the heck's the matter with you? I'm 35 years old carrying the same pack that you are. You don't see me out of breath. From somewhere in the back, a soldier shouted out, he never figured out who, but we're not as wild as you are, Bill. From that day on, Wild Bill Donovan stuck. He claimed he didn't like that nickname because it ran counter to the cool, calm, quiet spy image he wanted to project. But his wife Ruth said that he really did like to be called Wild Bill. He returned to New York, a hero, He became an assistant to the Attorney General in the Coolidge administration during the Roaring '20s. His goal at that point was to become Attorney General of the United States. And he thought Herbert Hoover, who succeeded Calvin Coolidge, had promised him that position. And in fact, Hoover had promised him the Attorney Generalship. But this is the late 1920s. The Ku Klux Klan is a very powerful political movement in this country, and it was up in arms over the idea of a Roman Catholic becoming Attorney General of the United States. Donovan, as any prominent figure in Washington, also made his share of enemies there. He was a prominent Republican. Senate Democrats vowed to block his nomination. Hoover reneged on the promise. Until the day he died, Donovan never forgave Herbert Hoover for denying him the Attorney Generalship. He returned to New York, went to New York City, founded the Donovan Leisure Law Firm, a very prominent law firm in New York City, made millions of dollars as a Wall Street lawyer. In 1932, he decided to dip his toe into politics once more. He ran for governor of New York. His idea then was to become the first Irish Catholic president of the United States. And the governorship of New York was an ideal stepping stone for the presidency. In many respects, it may still be today. Keep in mind, 1932, Franklin Roosevelt was running for his first term in office, and he had been governor of New York. Donovan ran against a guy named Herbert Lehman, who was Roosevelt's lieutenant governor. He ended up running as much against Roosevelt as he did against Lehman. Said some pretty nasty things about FDR on the campaign trail. At one point, he accused Roosevelt of being, quote, crafty. It sounds kind of mild by today's standard. But back then, that was fighting. Those are fighting words. Another time, he accused Roosevelt of being a Hyde Park faker, because Roosevelt claimed he was a simple farmer from Hyde Park, and Donovan said that was a bunch of baloney. Roosevelt, for his part, sent out surrogates on the campaign trail to take their shots at Donovan. In fact, Eleanor hit the trail and went after Donovan on different issues. Now, the reason I give you some of this backstory is it's amazing then that Franklin Roosevelt made Donovan his top spymaster, a very senior position, considering all the nasty things these two guys had said about each other in New York politics. But fast forward to 1940, going in 1941. Roosevelt is building up the nation's defenses. He's preparing the nation for war that he can see on the horizon. Donovan, even though he was a conservative Republican, he believed the New Deal was a communist plot to take over America. He though was a member of the internationalist wing of the Republican Party, he too also thought that the nation needed to build itself up for war, needed to build up its defenses. So you had two very canny, savvy politicians here who saw common cause in working with each other. In the summer of 1940, Roosevelt sends Donovan to England, basically just to answer a very simple question. Can Britain survive this war, or is it going to be occupied by Nazi Germany? And this was a question that Roosevelt didn't really have a clear answer to. He didn't really have a good read on Winston Churchill either. Later on, they would become very, very close. But at that point, he didn't know who this prime minister really was. So he sent Donovan over. Donovan was given access to the top levels of the British government, which is actually kind of unusual because here's an Irish American going over. And the British government, particularly Churchill's office, didn't know whether this guy is going to be an Anglophile or an Anglophobe. Turned out Donovan was a committed Anglophile. He was given access to MI6, MI5, Naval Intelligence, the War Ministry, the Foreign Office. Came back to Washington with a bag full of secret documents and an answer to Roosevelt's question, which was yes, Britain could survive the war, but it's going to need a considerable amount of material aid from the United States, which eventually came in the form of a Lend-Lease. At the end of 1940, the beginning of 1941, Roosevelt sent Donovan on a second mission to Europe. This time not only to England to collect more material, but also to tour the Balkans, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, again to gather up intelligence there, but also to deliver a very private message, particularly to Balkan leaders. And that was that if you, a Balkan leader, were sitting on the fence in this war, and many of them were at this point, just keep in mind that Franklin Roosevelt does not intend to let Great Britain lose this conflict. So if you're trying to decide which side you want to be on, keep in mind the winning side is going to be the Allied side. Roosevelt was delighted with this message that Donovan conveyed throughout the region. He sent a cable to, not Roosevelt, Churchill was delighted with the message that Donovan conveyed in the region. He sent a cable to Roosevelt saying that Donovan had been a heart-warming flame. Churchill also supplied a British plane to take Donovan around to the different countries, and British escorts, officers, to open doors for him, and also to keep an eye on him, to report back to London to make sure he stayed on message. One of those escort officers was Ian Fleming, who wrote the James Bond novels, and we've been listening to his music here with the James Bond music. The State Department, though, wasn't so pleased with this trip, because here you had somebody with no official government standing in either the US government or the British government strong-arming Balkan leaders behind closed doors. In fact, at one point, senior State Department aides discussed the possibility of whether Donovan should be prosecuted for violating the Logan Act, which makes it a crime for a private individual, private citizen, to negotiate on behalf of the US government. Roosevelt, however, was only too happy to have Donovan out there freelancing. Because keep in mind, 1940 going into 41, Roosevelt has no foreign intelligence service to speak of. There were tiny foreign espionage units in the Navy and the Army, but they were largely dumping grounds for poor-performing officers. Roosevelt is facing a very tough re-election fight for an unprecedented third term. He's running against Wendell Willkie, who's a very strong candidate. And Roosevelt was actually seriously worried that he was going to lose that race. And here he is making major foreign policy decisions overseas, largely blind to what lay ahead of him overseas. In fact, it worried him so much at times that he would become physically ill. When Donovan returns from those 2 European trips, that's when our spy story begins. In July 1941, Roosevelt signed an executive order. It made Donovan his coordinator of information. A year later, the organization would be redesignated the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, but it started out as the coordinator of information. It was just a one-page document he signed, very vaguely written. It said, Colonel Donovan, which had been his World War I rank, will collect information of national security interests for me, and will do other unspecified jobs. In fact, the document was so vague that members of Roosevelt's cabinet scratched their heads and wondered, what in the heck is Franklin doing here, appointing this Republican Wall Street lawyer who had been mentioned as a possible presidential candidate for the GOP to this nefarious position in the administration, doing all kinds of unspecified things. Donovan said that he began his organization really from -0, which is really the case. He only began with one guy, which was himself. In the beginning, he was kind of like a player in a pickup basketball game, looking for agents and operations anywhere he could find them. So, for example, the Philips Lamp Company, they made lamps, sold lamps worldwide. They're still in business. Donovan arranged privately with the Philips Lamp Company that when its salesmen went overseas, particularly into occupied countries, they would report back to the OSS on anything they saw that might be of interest or military value. The Eastman Kodak Company, my day, they made Brownie cameras. You all remember that. I think they just recently went out of business. Back then, the Eastman Kodak Company had thousands of camera clubs around the country. Donovan arranged for those camera clubs to send him photos that tourists had taken when they were overseas on vacation, particularly of militarily important sites. Pan Am Airways, probably all flown on Pan American at one time or another. Donovan had a project codenamed Cigar, where he secretly had ticket agents for Pan Am stations throughout Africa that would report back to him whenever Abwehr or Gestapo agents moved into the airports or came in or came out on different flights. He cooked up all kinds of wild schemes when he was OSS director. He's open to really any idea that crossed his desk. His code number, if you look on the secret OSS documents, was always 109, which just happened to be the room number of his office in his headquarters, excuse me, which was on Navy Hill right next to the State Department. His secretaries actually had another code name for him. They used to call him Seabiscuit, you know, after the racehorse, because he always seemed to be on the move all the time. He kept $2,000 in his desk drawer at all times, and that was to pay for informants for information when he was roaming around Washington. I don't think you'd find a CIA director today keeping $2,000 in his desk. He had a research and development chief, a guy named Stanley Lovell, who was a very famous New England inventor in his own right, and he was the guy who created all the spy gadgets for Donovan. Donovan used to call him his Professor Moriarty after the Sherlock Holmes character. Stanley Lovell built the things like the miniature cameras that spies used, the pistols with silencers, pencil-like explosive devices that could be used to detonate charges or for discreet assassinations. Donovan was also very, very interested in truth drugs and how they might be able to be secretly administered to an unwitting official to get him to spill the beans on different secrets. So one time, they decided to test the truth drugs out on a New York mobster, a guy named Little Augie. There was an OSS officer who had been a New York City cop who had busted Little Augie a number of times and eventually befriended the gangster. So one day, he invited Little Augie up to his apartment for some smokes and a chat. Well, laced within the cigarettes was a truth drug. It was tetrahydrocycline. And so Little Augie starts puffing away, and slowly getting a silly grin on his face and chuckling and telling the officer about working for Lucky Luciano and all the mob hits he's carried out and all the congressmen he's bribed. Of course, Little Augie's secrets were safe with Donovan. He couldn't bring him to trial or it would give away the truth drugs. He had all other kind of wild ideas that he would propose to Roosevelt. One of them was that he proposed that Roosevelt would have a button at his desk that he could punch at any time, and it would put him in instant radio communication with every radio in America. So that way, if the Japanese were going to bomb Los Angeles or the Germans were going to attack New York, Roosevelt could alert everybody. Roosevelt ignored that idea. But Roosevelt was a spy buff, spy aficionado in his own right. Ever since he was a teenager, he always enjoyed subterfuge and intrigue and keeping secrets. And in fact, Roosevelt sent ideas to Donovan that were kind of off the wall too. One of them was bats. You know, bats that fly, right? They were going to fit these bats with incendiary devices, tie them around them, okay? I'm not making this up, folks. And they're going to fly over Japan, drop the bats out of the plane, and the bats would fly into the paper and wood homes in Japan, into the eaves. The incendiary devices would go off and it'd burn down Japan. Great idea. Someone had written Eleanor with the idea. She passed it along to Franklin. Franklin thought it was cool and gave it to Donovan. So Stanley Lovell and his guys went out to the Midwest somewhere, got a bunch of these bats, fitted them with the incendiary devices, took them up in a plane, dropped them out of the plane. Guess what happened to the bats? Well, they all sank like stone. There was no way that idea was going to work. But, you know, Roosevelt didn't mind the failures, and Donovan was willing to try anything. In addition to being the father of the modern CIA, Donovan is also the father of modern special operations. If you go down to Tampa, Florida, to the headquarters of the U.S. Special Operations Command, they have in the main foyer, in a glass case, Donovan's uniform there and a lot of memorabilia from him. He is also considered the father of what we call today modern information warfare, things like psychological operations and cyber warfare. In Donovan's day, though, it was done with a technology that was really pretty crude, and it was called morale operations back then. And it consisted mainly of newspapers, leaflets, radios, and rumors. So, for example, Donovan's agents spread rumors in international papers, New York Times, Associated Press, or whatever, that top Nazis were fleeing Germany and going to hide out in Argentina. It was going to leave the German army high and dry. Marlene Dietrich, everybody remember her, very sultry German-American singer. She sang music for propaganda broadcasts that were beamed to German soldiers. Among the billions of leaflets they dropped on German soldiers, one of them was the League of Lonely Women leaflets. And what this had printed on it was that back home there was a League of Lonely Women, and that was having sex with the soldiers' comrades when they went back on leave. Now, who knows whether that had any effect on the frontline troops. But, I mean, another PSYOPs plan they tried out was Stanley Lovell's had a group of scientists concoct a set of female hormones, okay? And if they could find Hitler's vegetables, they're going to stay with me on this. If they could find Hitler's vegetables and inject it in there, it would make his mustache fall off and give him a falsetto voice, which of course would be a real bummer for the Fuhrer. Donovan turned out to be a horrible manager. In the 4 years he ran the OSS, he violated every rule they teach you at Harvard Business School or Public Administration School. And at one point, his own senior aides there tried to oust him. They tried to stage what became known as the Palace Revolt, move him up and out. Donovan, who by then had launched enough coups to smell one on it, being launched on himself, squashed it like a bug. But to his credit, though, he was a very charismatic leader. Okay? He rarely ever issued an order or a command. It was usually always a request, and his agents would follow him loyally and blindly. And eventually, Donovan built a spy organization of over 10,000 espionage agents, research analysts, commandos, and support staff scattered in OSS stations all over the world. They mounted a number of covert operations for the Torch invasion of North Africa in November 1942, did a lot of analysis of the Vichy French defenses there for the army invading in. They had extensive operations in Sicily and Italy. Had a lot of problems, though, in Italy, a lot of failures with the OSS there, and actually a lot of corruption that occurred within the units there. Sounds bad, but keep in mind Mark Clark's Fifth Army had a tough time conquering Italy and had a lot of problems with his forces. They mounted extensive operations, the OSS did in the Balkans, aiding partisan guerrillas in Greece and Yugoslavia. Interestingly, they had little operations going on in Asia. Douglas MacArthur, the commander of the Southwest Pacific Theater, banned the OSS from his theater, didn't want to have anything to do with them. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who's commander of the Northern Pacific Fleet, didn't see any use for Donovan's spies either. He thought he was fighting mainly a naval and amphibious war and didn't need spies roaming around there. Donovan's force then was relegated really to China and Burma. That was the only part of Asia that he really operated in. They had extensive operations before and after the Normandy landing in France. His research analyst did a considerable amount of analysis, topographic analysis of the beaches of Normandy for the invading armies. He had an economist on his staff who picked out bombing targets for Hap Arnold's 8th Air Force. He had hundreds of commandos and spies that dropped into occupied France before and after the invasion, on many of them on very dangerous missions. Donovan himself also liked to go in on every Allied landing, which horrified his senior staff, because the last place you want your top spymaster with all those secrets in his head is at the front, where he might be captured and he can be a very valuable prize for the other side. General George Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, thought he had Donovan banned from going in, prohibited from going in on the Normandy landing, and so did Dwight Eisenhower, who commanded the European forces. Donovan, though, managed to talk his way aboard a Navy heavy cruiser and then land at Utah Beach the second day after the first wave. He gets to the beach and a German Messerschmitt flies by, strafes the beach, and he has to dive under the Jeep for cover, dusts himself off, then walks inland about 3 or 4 miles looking for some of his operatives there. He wasn't going to find them, but he thought he'd just go in there and look for them. He gets pinned down by a German machine gun nest. He's with another aide. He reaches into his jacket pocket to pull out his L pill. That's a potassium cyanide capsule every OSS agent carried that he could chomp it out on and kill yourself instantly so you wouldn't be tortured. Realized, though, that he left his L pill at Claridge's Hotel in London. Very, very worried about it. In fact, he had his aide radio London as soon as they got back to the beach because he was worried, a maid might come in there and mistake it for an aspirin. It took Donovan almost 2 years to really build up his spy organization to get into this fight. Now, it sounds like a long time, but keep in mind, it took the U.S. Army almost that amount of time. So unprepared were we for World War II. Like any other intelligence agency, Donovan also had his intelligence failures. One of the most notable ones was the vessel case. Donovan thought he had a silver bullet agent planted inside the Vatican who was supplying him with verbatim transcripts of papal conversations that Pope Pius was having with not only with senior Vatican envoys all around the world, but also with foreign diplomats at the Vatican, including the Japanese ambassador there. Turned out Vessel was an Italian pornographer with a very vivid imagination and a real talent for concocting dialogue, and snookered Donovan's organization. Now, the third part of this story, the story of the political intrigue. Donovan liked to say that his enemies in Washington were as fierce as Adolf Hitler was in Europe, and that was really the case. He had ferocious feuds with J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. Hoover thought Donovan's organization was the biggest collection of amateurs he'd ever seen. And truth be told, it was a collection of amateurs in the beginning. Hoover had spies and moles planted in Donovan's organization reporting to him on what Donovan was doing. Donovan had spies and moles in Hoover's organization reporting to him on what Hoover was doing. When I was doing the research of this book, I wondered when the hell do they have time to spy on the Axis? They seem to be spying on each other so much. The Pentagon at first bitterly opposed the setting up of the Office of Strategic Services. George Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, thought that Donovan was trying to make himself an intelligence czar and was going to try and take over Army and Navy intelligence, which, if Roosevelt had let him, was exactly what Donovan wanted to do. Eventually, Marshall warmed up to Donovan and thought he did a lot of good things during the war. But Marshall's senior generals, particularly his intelligence generals, never did and fought a rearguard battle, bureaucratic battle against Donovan throughout the war. And in fact, at one point, they even set up a secret espionage unit in the Pentagon behind Donovan's back. It was nicknamed the Pond. And its mission was not only to spy on the Axis behind Donovan's back, but to spy on Donovan, to spy on his OSS officers. They even collected information on the wives of the OSS officers. Now, in any war, generals and admirals on the same side will fight among themselves. There's always fierce bureaucratic battles, and World War II was no exception. But in the case of Donovan, the bureaucratic battles became even more ferocious because conventional generals and admirals just didn't understand what this guy was about. I mean, when Donovan started talking about Little Augie and League of Lonely Women leaflets and sex hormones for Hitler, senior officers in the Pentagon really were truly disturbed by this. They thought the guy was deranged. Donovan also brought a lot of the problems on himself. He was a guy who never took no for an answer. So if someone in front of him, a general in front of him, said, "No, you can't do that, or it won't help you out," he had a habit of making an end run around the officer to get the decision reversed. That doesn't win you any friends in the Pentagon. One time he was at a Washington cocktail party talking to an admiral, and he had his OSS officers burglarize the admiral's office and steal documents off his desk and bring it to the cocktail party to show off to the admiral what his men could do. There was nothing in the records I could find with what the admiral's reaction was, but I assume he was probably nonplussed by it. Donovan would also show up to Pentagon meetings, usually late, immaculately tailored in his general's uniform. He bought it from Wetzel's in New York. And on the uniform, he would have sewn on it just his Medal of Honor ribbon, as a not-so-subtle reminder to all the generals and admirals in the room with their rows of ribbon, all that fruit salad, that he had the only one that really counted. Out in the field, though, he could be what one of his aides said was incorrigibly civilian. He would show up in his fatigues all wrinkled, looked like he just got out of bed. Sometimes he'd be wearing a Paisley ascot with him. You know, I don't think you'd find a commander in the Army today wearing a Paisley ascot on his fatigues. Again, as a reminder to everybody around him that this was an unconventional guy and he was running an unconventional unit. Eventually, Donovan couldn't overcome his political enemies. He had drafted a plan for a post-war Central Intelligence Agency, CIA after the war, and he wanted to lead that agency. Walter Trohan, who was a reporter for the McCormick-Patterson newspaper chain, the McCormick-Patterson newspaper chain, which was a strong Republican newspaper chain, really anti-Roosevelt. They despised Roosevelt, and Roosevelt despised the chain. Trohan got leaked to him a copy of Donovan's secret plan to set up a post-war CIA. And he published the entire plan in the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Times Herald, and a New York paper on the same day, along with a very inflammatory story accusing Donovan of wanting to set up a, quote, Gestapo-like organization that was going to spy not only on people overseas, but Americans at home. Back then, if you accused any organization of being Gestapo-like, that about sank it politically. And it did with Franklin Roosevelt. He basically shelved the plan. In comes Harry Truman, okay? Donovan and Truman just don't like each other, okay? It isn't going to work out with these two guys. Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, had an agent spread a particularly nasty rumor with Truman's senior military aide that got passed on to Truman that Donovan was having an affair with his daughter-in-law. Now, they played pretty hardball back then. I had to run that rumor to ground, check it out, and I could find that there was no evidence that was the case. But Donovan did have a number of affairs over the years, and it was common knowledge in Buffalo and Washington among military intelligence circles and also the CIA. That probably isn't what sunk Donovan with Harry Truman. What really did him in was, remember I mentioned the pond? It managed through a conduit in the White House to have a 59-page report placed on Truman's desk accusing Donovan's OSS of all manner of malfeasance and corruption and blown operations. In fact, at one point, they accused OSS officers of staging a sex orgy in India. Again, I couldn't find any evidence that was the case. Also, as I say, there was bad chemistry between Truman and Donovan. I mean, on the one hand, you had a millionaire Wall Street Republican lawyer, smooth-talking lawyer, and on the other hand, you had a very plain-spoken, die-hard Democrat who had not done so well as a Missouri haberdasher. Okay, there was just bad karma between these guys. On September 20th, 1945, Truman, this is after the war's over, Truman shuts down the OSS and parcels out its functions to the Pentagon and the State Department. Now, Truman was not deaf and dumb to the dangers that lay ahead of him overseas. I mean, he was a pretty savvy president. He could see, and he was going to see, the Cold War rolling out, and he realized he needed a foreign intelligence service. But he just didn't want to have Donovan or his OSS to be any part of that. In 1947, Truman sets up, organizes the Central Intelligence Agency as part of the Defense Department Act. Donovan wanted to lead that CIA in 1947. In fact, he had surrogates lobby Truman to make him CIA director, but Truman wasn't going to have any part of that, particularly after Donovan had said some mean things about Truman on the campaign trail. And presidents usually don't forget that kind of stuff that's said about him. 1953, Eisenhower becomes president, a fellow Republican like Donovan. Ike had thought Donovan had done some fine work in Europe. Donovan thought he had his best chance to be CIA director then. Instead, though, Eisenhower appoints Allen Dulles as CIA director. Dulles had been Donovan's station chief in Bern, Switzerland, and had done a fabulous job there, a lot of intelligence coups. Even so, Donovan was very bitter that Dulles became CIA chief. In fact, he thought Dulles would screw up the agency, and he went around bad-mouthing Dulles behind his back. Let me stop there. I didn't mean to drone on so long. If anybody's got any questions, we can talk a little more about Truman, intelligence, or the legacy of the OSS, or anything else you want to talk about.
I have a question.
Yeah.
John Foster Dulles walked through the stuff they go.
Uh-huh.
Kind of broke some rules. He did. And Dulles be on the same page.
In Donovan's case, well, first off, Roosevelt, as I say, was a big spy buff, a big spy aficionado. He kept Donovan on a short leash, although very often Donovan didn't realize he was on a short leash. And so he pulled him back a number of times. I mean, there's things Roosevelt didn't allow Donovan to do. Didn't allow him to take over Army and Navy intelligence. Roosevelt had senior generals there who were Donovan's rivals, these are men who despised one another, and Roosevelt, worked with them too. Donovan, though, where he could, he bent the rules. So, for example, Roosevelt worked out an agreement that J. Edgar Hoover would be in charge of spying in South America, actually all of Latin America. And Donovan couldn't have any agents there. But Donovan managed to get agents down there, and in fact, he managed to set up secret programs that he kept the accounts of overseas so Hoover couldn't sniff them out in Washington. So he could do some operations in there. Basically, his view was, well, I can't spy there, but if somebody walks into my door, I'm not going to be able to refuse them. But overall, as I say, he was kept on a leash. In the case of Allen Dulles, and also in the case of John Foster Dulles, everything they did, from Patrice Lumumba to the Bay of Pigs, or the preparation of that and the assassination plots, that was all. I mean, Eisenhower, gave him that leeway to do it, and in fact was egging him on too. But again, sometimes they'll stray outside the four corners of the piece of paper.
I enjoyed your book very much. Just a fascinating story. Would you mind talking a little bit about Donovan's relationship with William Stephenson?
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. William Stephenson was, just by way of background, was Great Britain's intelligence representative in the United States. He was head of what was benignly called British Security Coordination. And it was an office set up in New York. His official job was to liaison with the intelligence agencies here, and also with Hoover, the FBI, and also to monitor to make sure that the Nazi agents didn't sabotage any Lend-Lease war items that got sent to Britain. His real job was spying on the United States and undercutting through covert operations the isolationist movement that was very large in the United States before the war. His mission also from Churchill was to get the United States into the war. Donovan and Stephenson were very, very close. In fact, Donovan could not have built up his organization, the OSS, in the beginning without Stephenson's help and without the help of British intelligence, of MI6, the intelligence arm, and MI5, the counterintelligence arm. and naval intelligence too. So Stephenson, Ian Fleming, and others were camped out in Donovan's Georgetown home as he was putting together the OSS, giving him advice on how to do it, and they shipped him a lot of documents. Eventually, though, that relationship became strained. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, you got a 16-year-old kid that's been through driver's ed, finally gets their license and everything. The first thing they want to do is drive without dad in the car, which is what Donovan wanted to do. And so there were fierce battles between Donovan and the British intelligence over territory, who would cover what, fierce turf battles. A lot of bad blood between them. In fact, Donovan had spies and moles within Churchill's government reporting to him on what Churchill was doing. Churchill had moles and spies keeping an eye on Donovan, on his movement and the movement of senior OSS officers. I mean, we've had this recent kerfuffle about, you know, spying and NSA collecting evidence on our allies. You know, I can assure you that has a rich history going back all the way to World War II. Yep. Oh, okay.
Alluded to our present situation with NSA and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Have you developed any insights at all in terms of how civilian government can control Secret Service or the you know, the apparatus, since their basic function is to lie?
Well,
And we just had
yeah.
this situation where Director of Intelligence, National Intelligence, whatever, he told Congress just a flat-ass lie, you know, we're not doing this. Sure, this is a problem throughout history, but I appreciate your thoughts on it.
yeah, it's. I mean, that's why espionage services are set up, to lie. I mean, they're set up to break the laws of foreign countries and to lie either in their cover story and, you know, about what they're doing. The problem happens, of course, when that carries over to Congress. Richard Helms, a former CIA director, got convicted of lying to Congress. This was on the CIA operation in Chile to destabilize Salvador Allende. Helms's view was that, you know, Congress didn't need to know this secret. It's a very dangerous view to take in a constitutional government. I think, and just, you know, to doing, you know, years and years of research on it, a government, particularly a democratic government, has to have tight controls over its intelligence service. Culturally, very often, democratic forms of government and espionage and intelligence gathering are going to clash. And you're seeing that clash right now with the National Security Agency. How much you know, data collection are we going to allow in terms of, you know, the fight against worldwide terrorism? You know, where does it cross into intrusion so that, you know, every one of your phone calls being listened to or recorded by somebody, or at least the phone number being kept track of? It has to involve then leaders and presidents who, A, have to know and want to know what's going on and can keep a tight rein on it. Now, what I've discovered in past histories is that the presidents aren't as out of the loop as very often they you know, claim to be. You know, I mean, say Eisenhower knew in great detail what Allen Dulles was doing, you know, at the CIA and the covert operations, the ones that got the agency in trouble. So did Kennedy too. But I think in any democratic government you're going to need, you know, it's essentially, you know, you have tight oversight and tight controls. And I think the agencies can work under those type of strictures.
You mentioned the personality clashes between Truman and Donovan, and also MacArthur's antipathy toward the OSS in the Southwest Pacific area. That led to the disestablishment of the OSS, creation of the CIA. Would you comment on how all of that then directly affected intelligence collection prior to the outbreak of the Korean War, since it all occurred right within that, a couple of years prior to that?
Yeah, it had a profound effect. It also had, in MacArthur's case, it had a profound effect on the intelligence collection in his operation. His chief intelligence officer was a guy named Captain Willoughby, who, if you look among military historians, they insist that he was probably the dumbest intelligence officer that ever walked on 2 feet. MacArthur had, significant intelligence failures in a lot of his campaigns. Misreading of Japanese defenses, misreading of beach conditions. He was saved by MAGIC. Does everybody know what MAGIC was? That was the radio interception and decoding capability the Army and the Navy had for Japanese diplomatic and naval codes. Even so, there were a lot of people, a lot of GIs and Marines that lost their lives in the Pacific because of poor intelligence. Now, whether the OSS could have made much of a difference, I don't know. The OSS claimed they could have. In the case of, I'm not a Korean War expert in terms of the lead up to that, but I know there was a gap there from, basically from 1945 to 1947. We had a lot of interim type organizations. One was the Central Intelligence Group, and there were other ones, and they were kind of Rube Goldberg type of collections patched together that didn't really work out until you actually had a CIA formed. But I can say, at least in the Pacific theater, there was, there was a lot of problems out there. I mean, actually, MacArthur, at one point, he offered to allow Donovan's men to come in, but they had to basically switch uniforms. They had to come directly under his command, just like any other private, and not under Donovan, not be part of the OSS, and Donovan wouldn't have anything to do with that.
So, this goes back to just before World War II, when Donovan's probably just getting his feet wet.
Mm-hmm.
But Dusko Popov read his book, and he was a double agent working with the British Double X Committee, mainly out of Lisbon. But he did go to New York, tried to pass the word about Pearl Harbor, and Hoover wouldn't listen.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering how Donovan might have hooked into that.
That's called the Tricycle Case, the code name for it. And I didn't do a whole lot of research into it, although it was interesting. The CIA's top historian, a guy named Thomas Troy, who did a dissection of all that, and this is whether Popov had alerted Hoover to the attack on Pearl Harbor, and Hoover ignored the intelligence. The CIA eventually concluded that that wasn't really the case, that there was kind of what they call a lot of noise, intelligence noise coming in, most of which never got to Hoover. And in fact, there wasn't a silver bullet piece of intelligence that would alert them that Pearl Harbor was going to happen. Keep in mind, just in the kind of the context, it was no big revelation that the Japanese were, that Pearl Harbor was a dangerous target. I mean, as early as 1920, the War Department had plans for a secret sneak attack on Pearl Harbor and how they were going to deal with it. And Roosevelt, even the day before the attack, had gotten the last intercepted MAGIC message of the diplomatic cable traffic and knew, I mean, he sat in the White House talking with Harry Hopkins, he said, this means war. So he knew the Japanese, were going to war. What he didn't know was the time and the place. And in fact, nobody really knew that, mainly because MAGIC, the code-breaking capability, was only breaking diplomatic codes at that point, not the naval codes. So he didn't have the exact time and place. There are a lot of kind of these conspiracy books about, well, for example, did Roosevelt know ahead of time and allow the attack to happen, which is really not the case. But there just really wasn't any, silver bullet agent that could have provided the news that would have, stopped that terrible tragedy from happening.
This will have to be the last question.
Oh, okay.
Time constraints, so go ahead.
Just one quick question, sir. Colonel Aaron Bank is often referred to as the father of Army Special Forces. In fact, his book is entitled OSS to Green Beret.
Right.
Was there a relationship between him and Donovan, or was he low enough in the organization that he really didn't have any interface with him?
They may have met. Aaron Bank, who was a very famous Green Beret, was a member of the Jedburghs, which was a commando force that parachuted into occupied France after the invasion and acted as liaison with Eisenhower at Schaeff, and did a lot of commando operations. And Aaron Bank was one of the Jedburghs that parachuted into occupied France. Very dangerous mission. I'm sure he met Donovan because Donovan loved his commandos. In fact, he would have jumped in himself if they'd let him. In fact, at one point he went to Roosevelt and said, I'd like to command a division of guerrillas in the Philippines. Let me go there. Of course, MacArthur didn't think too highly of that idea. So I'm sure Aaron Bank met him. In fact, yeah, I'm correct. All the Jedburgh commandos had to be interviewed by Donovan before they finally, went over to Europe. So he saw him there. Now, it's interesting, though, if you talk to Aaron Bank, he would probably say, yeah, we were old friends. Donovan talked to me like, I was one of his son and everything, arm around the shoulder, turning on the Irish charm. Donovan did that with everyone. You forget his name, the next minute. But when he was, talking to that agent then, it was like your Uncle Fred there. And in fact, that was one of the reasons the agents would follow him anywhere. He would talk in kind of that soft purr and say, I know this is a dangerous mission, but if I could, I would go with you. And he actually meant it. And so then they went off on a dangerous mission. Usually later, in fact, it got to be kind of a joke within OSS circles, about, Donovan coming and putting his arm around an agent and saying, this is an easy, if I could go with you, I would. That meant you were headed for trouble. Thank you. Sure.
Well, our thanks to Douglas Waller for a wonderful presentation. Let me remind you that his biography of Wild Bill Donovan is for sale right outside in the lobby, and we look forward to seeing all of you at the next program here. Thank you very much.
Very good.